95% of you listen to the podcast to get informed on property. 4% of you listen to the podcast because you like our silly jokes. And 1% of you listen because you're our mums. This week on the Property Podcast, we have an investor survey.
Yeah, welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning property investors come together to get informed and inspired. This week we're letting you in on what other members of the Property Hub community are thinking. How many properties are they going to be buying? How many are they going to be selling? And what do they think about all the different changes and legislation and rumours that are floating around at the moment? Well, in this episode, you're going to find out. We've also got a really interesting news story, and if you stick around to the end for Hub Extra, we've got another podcast that you won't be wanting to miss. Now, just a quick one to remind you that September is upon us. The summer is over. The kids are back at school, and you suddenly realise, oh dear, there's only a few months of this year left and I really need to up my game. Well, in that case, you should be getting along to a meetup. They're happening all over the country tonight. It's the first Thursday of every month. And what a perfect one to get along to if you want to make this your first one, or if you haven't been for a while. You can meet friendly people, you can get local knowledge and get yourself fired up to take advantage of the rest of the year. If you haven't booked your place yet, then just go to thepropertyhub.net/meetups. It's completely free.
So Rob, news story of the week, and it's a pretty broad headline. Good luck with answering this. Just how good are buy-to-let investments?
Yeah, I'll spoil it for you. The answer is pretty good. There's a bit more detail behind that. What they've done this piece of research is look back over 50 years and identify with each time period of 5 years within that 50. If you invested just for those 5 years, would you have made money or lost money by investing in property? Now, this is kind of an artificial scenario because we always talk about property investment being for the long term, and you wouldn't really get into property necessarily just expecting to be in it for 5 years to make money. But the results are really interesting, and it tells you something about the property cycle as well. So the main headline is that there are only 5-year periods in the last 50 years where you would have lost money over those 5 years if you bought in on year 1 and sold out on year 5. So on the face of it, that sounds pretty good. Even if you just picked when you get into property completely at random, then over 5 years, you'd make money the vast majority of the time. But where things get really interesting is when you look at the years when you would have lost money over 5 years if you got into property at that time. And those years cluster around 2 times. There's 1989, 1990 and 91. And then there's 2007 and 2008. So if you just avoided those 2 small periods of time, then you would have made money every single time. So why I think this is interesting, Rob, is this analysis, it doesn't mention the property cycle, but the property cycle is exactly what it's talking about. We talk about the winner's curse and avoiding the peak of the market. Those are the 2 market peaks right there. And if all you'd done was avoid those big, obvious, in hindsight, peaks, then you would have won every single time.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you look at the data, because people will often say, oh, when's the best time to buy in property? But actually, it's much easier to say, when isn't? Because there's only those very small windows that property doesn't make sense. And let's face it, the world's a bit crazy during those windows. It's easy to say it with hindsight, as Rob's pointed out, but actually the markets were absolutely bonkers then. So you could just ask yourself, is the market absolutely bonkers right now? Well, the answer today would be no. So therefore, it's a good time. But take 2006 as an example, which people could say was still pretty bonkers. You know, the market was super aggressive back then. Even if you bought in 2006 and the crash was 2 years later, you still would have made money if you sold 5 years down the line. That's pretty incredible. Most people will consider 2006 a bad year to buy, but it just shows you how resilient the property market is if you take a long-term approach. Now, of course, there are periods where you can make fantastic gains in a short period of time. But if you're in it for the long game, then you're going to go through those 5-year periods. And if you're in it for the long game, you may go through those blips, but knowing that you're going to come out of them again. So a lot of people get nervous about timings and property. But if you're in it for the long term, something we really do go on about a lot, but for good reason, you can relax. And that's what this news story gives you, is peace of mind. So over the last few weeks, we've been sending out a survey because, dear Hubber, we want your opinion. We want to know where your heads are at. Rob and I have a sense, but podcast is pretty one way. You know, we talk at you, but we want to know what you're thinking. Where is your head at when it comes to the property market? And, well, you've answered in your droves. So thank you so much for doing this. It really does help us to understand you, but it also helps give you a voice as well.
Yeah, the fantastic thing about the Property Hub community is because of its size, together we've got a voice that needs to be listened to. So we're going to be sharing these results with the media. We routinely get quoted in the big national papers these days, and that means that there's a chance to let them know what you're thinking. It won't have escaped your attention that often what you see in the press about property investing is pretty one-sided. So this is a chance to bring back a bit of balance. And the interesting thing as we get into the results is they really show quite a nuanced picture of what property investors are like and what they're thinking. And it's really not at all like what you'd expect if you just read the papers. So thank you for helping us to do that. We'll be getting these messages out there over the next couple of months. But for today, let's share those results with you. And Rob, there's some really interesting stuff in there that'll be good to chat through.
So we're going to start with the question, how many properties are you planning to buy in the next 12 months? And what I will say, throughout this podcast, we will round the numbers. So if it's 30%, 0.1, we'll call it 30%. So if the rounding at some point doesn't work, it's not because the maths hasn't worked, it's just because we've rounded. Well, what amazed me here, Rob, is the number of people who put one or two properties totaled nearly 60%. Which, considering we're in a mid-cycle wobble, there's loads of negative media reports out there, that so many people are still planning to push ahead, which, for me, is so pleasing because it just shows that our audience isn't warped by what's being reported out there.
Yeah, exactly. And it also, I think, gives you comfort that if you are looking to buy one or maybe two, then you're normal. Don't think that everyone else is out there buying absolutely loads. Only 5% of people said they were looking to add 4 properties over the next 12 months. So this ties in with what we're talking about being a long-term thing. You don't have to go absolutely bonkers in a year and do loads and loads and loads. If you do just buy one or two in the next 12 months, the difference that will make to your financial situation in 10, 20 years is going to be absolutely enormous.
What's really interesting as well is the amount of people looking to sell. It came in at just under 3%. Now, that suggests to me that sort of percentage, that's just a normal sell-off level, that people are doing that as part of their strategy. You know, they may be coming to a point in their strategy where they want to sell off to realise some of the capital. I would expect a higher number than 3% if it was because of the market conditions or nervousness. I'm sure some people in that 3% are feeling that, but 3% for me seems pretty low. So, what is the media so negative about? What events could be making people consider selling? Well, clearly it's Brexit. So in our next question we asked, in event of a no-deal Brexit, how do you think your investment plans will change?
And the answer to that is, for the most part, not too much. 70% of the people who answered said it's unlikely to affect their plans either way. So we hear a lot about it, but from a property investment point of view, 70% of people are going to carry on regardless. Under 3% of people said that if that happened, they'd be likely to start selling some of their properties. And about 15% said that they wouldn't be selling, but they might be scaling back their plans. So all in all, under 20% would see it as any kind of negative, and 70% are just going to plough ahead.
What I love though, Rob, is the number of people who said they're likely to buy more because of no deal. Whereas nearly 3% said they'd sell. Nearly 8% said they'd buy more. And I think that's people really understanding where we are in the cycle and the opportunity that we've got right now. And that the more negative the news, the better the buying opportunity. What's great to see, Rob, is that people are in agreement with us and our viewpoint that actually we're in a good time for buying right now before we move into a boom period.
Yeah, there's so much noise around this topic, and it's good to hear that people are, for the most part, notching that out and thinking about the underlying economics that we've talked about so much. So Brexit and whatever happens with that is a change to come. But there's been an enormous amount of changes that we know about that have taken place over the last few years, largely around tax. The question we asked was, how many properties are you likely to sell in the next 3 years as a result of the tax changes that have already been announced? And Rob, we know that investors aren't very happy about a lot of the changes that have happened, but in terms of whether it's going to force them out of the market, which is something we've heard so much about, it seems not. 85% saying that they're not going to sell any properties as a result of these changes.
Yes, again, Rob, it's kind of different to the noise, this answer of what's going out there, but that's a really high percentage, so it's not a fluke. And what's interesting is that the second highest number we had on this for how many you would sell was 1. So people would only sell 1 in the next 3 years with the tax changes. And that came in at 9%. So of those people who are planning to do something, they're not planning on being that drastic. So that might be that it doesn't fit their current tax strategy, or it's an underperforming asset in the current tax climate. It seems that the vast majority of people are not going to be liquidating their portfolios and giving up.
But maybe that's not it. Maybe there are further changes ahead. How would investors respond to that? We asked, how many of your properties are you likely to sell in the next 3 years if the government announces further tax measures? Well, still, investors seem like a resilient lot. But what if there are more changes to come? Maybe that's not the end of what the government has in store for us. Well, we wanted to know what investors would do. So we asked, how many of your properties are you likely to sell in the next 3 years if the government announces further tax measures, for example, restricting interest relief in companies? Well, the number of people who would weather that out falls, but it doesn't fall massively. So the number of people who said they wouldn't sell any falls from 84% at the moment to 66%. So the vast majority of people, even if there are further negative changes that affect property investors, would still not sell.
Yeah, you would expect to fall there. And let's face it, it's pretty grim, the thought of more tax changes. So let's hope the government's had enough, they're listening to us, and they stop. Another proposal from the government is new tenancy agreements being a minimum of 3 years in length. So we asked, what would need to happen for you to support this policy? Now, it's interesting, Rob, because only just over 4% of people said nothing. I would support this policy regardless. I must admit, I'm slightly surprised at how unsupported this policy is. I thought that number may have been a little bit higher. I would have been one of those 4% had I filled this survey.
Well, it seems like investors are looking for something in return if they're going to offer this. The most common thing that investors said they wanted, nearly 82%, said they wanted a way to remove tenant who falls into arrears that's faster than the current method. And I think that's fair enough. Sometimes with a 12-month tenancy, if tenants fall into trouble halfway through, you haven't got that long to go until you can get them out using Section 21 if you need to, because that's the quickest way. If that happens in a 3-year tenancy, it causes you a bit more of a problem. I can see why investors would want to see that. The next most common, 63% of people want the ability to increase the rent during the tenancy, so they don't want to lock that rent in for 3 years. And I thought that number was surprisingly high, but I can see why that's something that people would want. And the next most common, 58%, is tax incentives. So it's a real give and take thing. If we're going to offer tenancies of 3 years, we want something back. So tax incentives like the ability to deduct more mortgage interest than you otherwise can wins a lot of support.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, Rob. I'd like something more. So while I support the policy in general, if they're willing to sweeten it, I'm willing to have it. Our next question was around landlord licensing, and we wanted to know what would need to happen for you to support national licensing for all landlords. And what was really pleasing is the answer that was selected the most, the highest percentage given at nearly 65%, was a plan to ensure that it would discourage rogue landlords. So, for example, non-registration could be detected and enforced. And I think that's great that landlords just want to be seen as good people who do good things and not as evil as often the media will portray it. The majority of landlords are just buying in property investments to, provide for their futures. Nothing aggressive. They're not looking to screw over tenants. And actually quite the opposite. They want to provide good homes. And that's really come across. And that so many people have selected that answer as a reason to motivate them to supporting this.
Yeah, this is the answer that I was happiest to see because I think it says a lot about who the audience is. And it sums up exactly how I feel. Just let us know that it's doing something. Got no problem with licensing schemes if you can actually show that they work. I think the problem with all the local schemes that you have at the moment is there's very scant evidence that they actually do anything. You get the feeling that if you just don't register and ignore the whole thing, then you'll probably be okay. And so everyone's paying hundreds of pounds a year for something that doesn't really achieve anything. So I'm really pleased to see that, like I would be, if you could actually show that there's a point to it, then fine, let's do it. There are certain other things that people would want to see as well, like the annual fee not being more than £100 a year and the removal of other schemes that are already in place. And less than 9% of people said that they would oppose this policy regardless. So I think that's great. It shows that Hubbers are open-minded. Despite everything that's come our way over the last few years, there's not just like a knee-jerk response of no to anything more. If they can show that it's actually going to work and it's going to do something to improve things for tenants, then 9 out of 10 people would support it.
So thank you to all those wonderful Hubbers. We've picked out some of the key questions that you answered there. And hopefully it's useful to know what everyone else is thinking. We all operate in our own property worlds and we hope that other people are like-minded and think the same way. But this shows that we really are. As a community, we really do have very similar beliefs and investment philosophies. And I think that gives you comfort that when it is tough or you're doing something that everyone else in the normal world seems to think is mad, investing in property, that actually, you've got a big group of people that fully support what you're doing and are doing exactly the same.
Yeah, and I'm glad we got to highlight this on the podcast because for us, this isn't just about having a podcast. The podcast is our chance to have a chat and to say what we think, but this is about the community, and it's a community that's thousands and thousands of people strong. And so much great stuff happens there that we try to highlight on the podcast, and everything that we can do to amplify that community and make it stronger and get the word out about what we're doing and what everyone's thinking, we are very happy to do. So stick around because Hub Extra is coming up and we're going to be telling you about something that we've both been really enjoying recently. But first, we always take the time to acknowledge someone who's left us a 5-star review. And you know what? I never get to read these out, so I'm going to quickly swoop in before Rob gets a chance. The first one comes in from Pie-Eyed, who says, as someone who's been thinking about my own need to generate a pension and wondering whether property could be the right vehicle for me, I've been listening to 10 to 20 episodes a week, wow, for the last couple of months, and I've just hit 150. This stuff is amazing, clear and concise information, holding nothing back, even teaching you how to do things that their own businesses sell as services. I recommend this show to anyone either thinking about property or even just wondering where their pension will come from. Personally, I hope to be able to save enough to buy my first property within 2 years. Thank you, Rob and Rob, for the motivation. Well, you are very welcome. And the next one is from Zinyi S, who says, I'm a newbie to property investment. Before I found you, I almost choked on the amount and the mix of information online and from friends. Listening to you explaining helps me hugely and gives me the confidence to see this through. Well, thank you for that pair of fantastic reviews. If you haven't left your own yet, then make sure you get over to Apple Podcasts and do that because it helps other people to find the show and we love reading them out.
Okay, Hub Extra time. And this is the point in the podcast where we bring you extra. We want to bring you a resource, a tip, an insight, or some inspiration that will add to your week, that will make it that little bit richer. And, of course, this is backed up by the Hub Extra email, which will hit your inbox every single Friday. Remember, you have to be signed up to the Property Hub Forum, which is free, of course, so why wouldn't you be? And you will get this email. And we aim to make it the most valuable email that hits your inbox every single week. And this week on the podcast, we've got another podcast for you, which is called Business Wars. And it is absolutely brilliant. Hat tip to producer Dan for putting us onto this one.
Yeah, it's a great listen because it's one of those podcasts, just like listening to a really great story. It takes you through some of the great business battles like Nintendo versus Sony, Ford versus Chevrolet, eBay versus PayPal, and Coke versus Pepsi. Rivalries that you'll be aware of, but you won't know the story behind them. And it just does such a great job of bringing that to life and making you realise what was going on behind the scenes and what was at stake. I'm currently listening to the episodes about Netflix versus Blockbuster. So I knew that Blockbuster had ceased to exist. And I knew that Netflix was doing really well, but I didn't know half of the things that were going on. The lengths that these companies go to win against each other is absolutely unbelievable. So it's a great podcast, a really easy listen and an enjoyable one. You'll learn absolutely loads without expending any effort at all, which is just how we like it.
So that concludes another episode of the Property Podcast. Remember, let us know what you're thinking. We have social channels where you can let us know your thoughts. You can go to @PropertyHubUK on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram, wherever you prefer. Or, of course, you can go directly to the Property Hub Forum and leave us your feedback there as well. We love getting your feedback. We build the shows based on what you tell us. So please keep it coming. Good, bad, ugly, we don't care. We just want to produce podcasts that you love. And if you want to find out about some of the work that we do outside the podcast and the forum, well, make sure you get along to the propertyhub.net/discover, where we have a monthly webinar talking about our other business services that help out property investors. So we'll be back on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob, and of course back this time next week with the Property Podcast. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.